Greetings YouTube, this is Remarkable Republican here once again to bring you the truth, but truth-flavored bias. I considered doing an episode 9 review, but upon further reflection I decided there were already a few too many of those around. So instead what I'll do is a character arc study looking at the characters who were first introduced in the originals and whose stories continued through to the sequels. I excluded the Emperor Palpatine from this because I've already done a character study in depth of him where I argue that he is the intergalactic bullqueer of the galaxy far, far away. In this video, we'll be looking at Luke, Leia, Han, Chewbacca, the droids, and Lando Calrissian. If we start out with Luke's story early on, he was, in A New Hope and in Empire Strikes Back, a whiny little bitch. Even though he was a young man of about 20, he looked like he was a 45-year-old lesbian, and generally he was kind of a whiny bitch who had some potential, but really didn't have any skill yet. He was kind of useless in the first two movies, and early on, before he realized that Leia was a sister, he was in sort of a romantic competition with Han, and he was losing badly, which is never good if he's supposed to be the main character. Eventually, he accepts who he is and what he must do. This is in Return of the Jedi. He then dresses in black like Johnny Cash, confronts his father and the Emperor, but ultimately, while he does have the balls to try, he barely defeats his father and then is just getting a bitch slapped around by the Emperor until his daddy comes to save him. Of course, when I say his daddy finishes the job, we now know that that was not the case. The Emperor survived the Death Star explosion, and yeah. So, Luke did not accomplish his mission. He didn't know that, apparently. The Force was not strong enough with him for him to detect that he had failed. He then tries to rebuild the Jedi Order, and he proves to be a poor Jedi Master, and an uncle so bad that Scar from The Lion King could give him advice on how to be a good uncle. He tried to murder Kylo Ren, and then set in motion a series of events whereby Kylo Ren became the right-hand man of an Empire replacement, thus undoing everything that Luke and his friends fought for. Luke then loses all of his confidence and gives up, which is a real bitch move. Fundamentally, he showed no real growth. He started out as a bitch and stayed that way. He ended up becoming a middle-aged man with imposter syndrome. And to his credit, at least when he grew the beard, he looked like a man rather than a lesbian. But my point about the imposter syndrome is that this is something that people get when they're in their early 20s and they're starting to do things that are adult activities that they've never done before and they're not certain of themselves. Luke apparently did not have this when he was young, but then all of a sudden, now that he's 50-something years old, he suddenly doesn't feel like a real Jedi anymore because he can't just dress in black and have his daddy save him. When the First Order arises after he basically set that in motion through his idiotic uncle Ing, he then is MIA. The galaxy's falling apart and Luke is nowhere to be found. Rey comes to him, which she shouldn't have had to do, and Luke refuses to train her. Then, when he decides to help, rather than getting in his X-Wing, which was right there in the water, he instead uses some sort of bullshit force projection and basically zooms into this place, uses a little bit of deception, and ends up killing himself by overexerting himself through this long-range projection. Another thing which really undermines Luke's validity as a character is that the Rise of Skywalker should be his story, or at least the story of someone taking up his legacy, but in fact it's not about him, it's about Rey, who ends up being a Palpatine. Thus, the Rise of Skywalker is the story of the Emperor Palpatine's granddaughter coming to power after Luke failed to defeat the Emperor in Return of the Jedi. So the Rise of Skywalker, if you take Rey as a Skywalker, is only possible because Luke was a terrible Jedi Master, and ultimately a terrible character. He wasn't that great in the original trilogy, but the sequels absolutely butchered him and turned him into something completely irredeemable and useless. That is why I call his arc overall the beta male. When we first meet Leia in A New Hope, she is a princess running away from the Empire, and she is a damsel in distress. Pretty classic trope of literature. Anyway, she then loses her planet due to her rebel activity. She rebels against Darth Vader and the Emperor, and in retaliation, they destroy her planet. As I've argued in the past, this was very much a bull queer move on the part of the Emperor Palpatine, and Leia should have known better than to tempt them in that way. She should have been able to judge them better if she had been a good politician and a good leader, but clearly she wasn't. So now she is the princess of a dead planet, and it's kind of ridiculous. There are people calling her princess, even though no one who is alive other than her remembers her being a princess or was one of her subjects. However, Leia has a bit of an arc because while fighting the Empire and trying to avenge her planet of Alderaan, she found love, family, and ultimately the Force. She rejected her Force training, however. We learn in the Sequel Trilogy that she became a very good Jedi and that she could go toe-to-toe with her twin brother Luke, yet she decided not to pursue the Force, even though not long after that a new threat emerged and she needed to reel her son back in. She could have become powerful in the Force and kept him in line. She didn't. She could have challenged Snoke with her Force abilities. She didn't. So she developed these abilities and put them to poor use, which means that once again she is a poor political leader. She had gifts she refused to use for reasons that are stupid. So she also made some really bad decisions, and she tried to become a military leader despite the fact that her only claim to this is that she was a member of the Senate, she was Luke's sister, and she was the princess of a dead planet. So she used that to become an admiral, even though I don't know that there's any reason to think she knows anything about space warfare. Certainly she never served aboard a ship and manned the guns or anything of that nature. And she was so bad at running a navy that she made Holdo senior to Akbar, so that when Leia was incapacitated, her new commander, after she was taken out, was Holdo, someone who was kind of like this convoy duty person who was a total fop, who had no idea what she was doing. She could have put Akbar in charge instead, someone who, hell, should have been in charge in the first place since he's an actual Navy guy, but whatever. And finally, if we look at the actual results rather than just looking at the details of her decisions, I didn't see any evidence of any victories that Leia contributed to in any meaningful way between the original trilogy and the sequel trilogy. She presided over failure. Her resistance movement failed to save the New Republic. She lost her fleet. She did not build a very good navy. She had a poor hierarchy. She couldn't keep her brother around to fight the rising evil. She couldn't keep her son in line. She ended up just proving to be a pretender princess. She might have the title, but she didn't deserve it, and she was never worthy of it. Han Solo has no real character arc, but we'll discuss it anyway. He starts out as a generic assistant hero who can't really do all that much of interest on his own, and he stays that way. He never evolves into any kind of real leader, and he also never really changes in any meaningful way aside from getting older. He was a generic assistant hero from the outset with some fake edginess, but he did have some role early on because we had an old Obi-Wan who's been on the shelf for 20 years, doesn't know his way around the galaxy anymore, and you have a green as grass, young, middle-aged lesbian in Luke Skywalker, so you need someone who's a little bit streetwise. That's Han. Leia can't be streetwise. She was sheltered as a princess, so again, you have to have Han. But by the time we get to Return of the Jedi, there's no real usefulness for Han Solo. He's a guy who can fly and shoot in a universe where everyone can fly and shoot, so his skills are a bit expendable. You could replace him with anyone. See Poe Dameron, the version of Han Solo from the sequel trilogy, who's actually a little bit better. But Han Solo does know a lot of people, and he understands customs. He knows how to sneak around and get into places, and he also has some connections at bars and different places. He ends up serving as Luke's muscle and as Leia's man. Ultimately, by the time of Return of the Jedi, he becomes sexually submissive to Leia. I assume this is because she's using Jedi mind tricks. Maybe she doesn't even know she is. Anyway, he went on to become a family man for a while. He had a son, Ben, but then, of course, Luke basically fucked all that up, and rather than trying to save his son and keep his family together by staying with his wife, Han instead abandons them, which is another failure of Leia, of course, and he reverts to his old ways of running around with Chewbacca and trying to be a smuggler. There's also the possibility that there's some kind of weird romantic thing between Han and Chewie, but I'll explore that a bit more in a minute. His arc is that he goes back to what he was all along and what everyone ultimately ends up as. Everyone who's a bad father will eventually have some moment where they try to connect with their child and they try to make things right. Han Solo has that moment. It's another trop, which is an old as time itself, and he dies, which I thought was actually a pretty cool twist in The Force Awakens, that the one time that Han becomes responsible and tries to do the right thing, he really gets fucked hard, whereas otherwise when he's stealing from people and dicking around, he usually gets away with it, things work out. But this one time where he does the right thing, it doesn't work out. That was one thing about Force Awakens I admired. But that being said, Han's character arc is a pretty weak one, and I feel like none of the 4 movies he appeared in did him any favors, and he could have basically been replaced by nearly anyone. You could have Harrison Ford in the role and just call the character something else. It'd make very little difference. Next up, we have another character who actually was present in the prequels as well, and that is Chewbacca, Han Solo's BFF. We learn a bit more about Chewie in the Christmas special and also in the Solo spin-off movie, but even with all of the screen time he's gotten over the years, we still don't really know anything meaningful about him, and basically he is sort of Han Solo on steroids with more fur, insofar as Han Solo is completely replaceable, and then Chewie is even more so. At least Han has a bit of a character in the sense that he is torn between selfishness and duty. Chewbacca is just a walking carpet who is there to help them kick ass, and that's pretty much all he ever does. He can shoot and fly, and that's all he does. He's basically an NPC who helps out your party and doesn't really contribute anything in terms of dialogue. We don't really have a Chewbacca storyline. The only sort of emotional moment he has is actually in TFA, which the more I think about it from a character development standpoint, maybe TFA is a little better than it gets credit for, because we see that Chewbacca genuinely did have some sort of relationship with Han, and that he was genuinely pissed off when his friend got killed. Of course, the only reason Chewbacca is in Star Wars is because there was an obsession in the 80s when it was made with Bigfoot, and George Lucas is also a liberal who believes in forcing diversity on people, and what could be more diverse than some made-up species. It also checks the box for all the people in the 80s who believed in Bigfoot, which was like half the population, so there you go. He more or less evolved from failed freedom fighter to a sidekick to the Avenger of Han Solo, so his role does evolve a bit, but his character itself does not. I think there is a possibility, I'm not 100% sure on this, that there was a possible romance between Chewie and Han. It's also possible that Chewie had an unrequited interest in Han, whereas Han was more of a heterosexual who didn't really understand that Chewie was trying to get with him, and that's why he kept hanging out with him after all this time. I mean, because even though Chewie lives a long time because of his species, he was still spending decades with Han, which, if there wasn't some sort of feeling there beyond just friendship, and they're not really that successful at smuggling, it's hard to explain why Chewie's willing to put up with Han, who's getting older and still hasn't really become a great smuggler who can make a lot of money after all this time. R2D2 and C3PO are the droid assistants to Luke and the other heroes. Their main role is to serve as slaves. That is another trop of literature that George Lucas drew upon. It's sort of like in stories about the South in the Civil War, how there would be the loyal body servant who would protect his master from harm, and make sure that he had his gun and all that. Well, this is what C3PO and R2D2 basically do, but on a more sophisticated level, because they have a lot of technical skills. At least R2D2 does. Effectively, C3PO is a gay robot butler who helps to smooth over things and talk, or at least that's what he does in theory. In practice, he just runs around and whines and bitches. And then you have the fixer Roomba, who's basically a mechanic droid in R2D2. He actually helps to fly the X-Wing and open doors and hack into computers and stuff like that. But effectively, he is functioning as a kind of mechanical slave. The two of them exhibit little character growth, even though they are in all 9 movies, and I think maybe 1 or 2 of them actually appear in some of those spin-off movies also. One character change they do have that's interesting is that C3PO, despite being a robot, becomes more sentimental over time. We see in episode 9 that he actually does show some character growth because he is aware of the fact that he might not get to see his friends again, and that while he'll probably survive and keep going because he is a robot, his friends are all becoming older and going gray and probably going to die soon. So he does kind of pass the Turing test for the first time and shows some signs of actual artificial intelligence rather than just being able to, spit out ones and zeros and whatever. He actually also has a purpose finally after being fucking useless because he knew Sith. R2D2, of course, far more important and useful, but didn't really have a character arc to speak of. So basically R2D2 is a very useful NPC, whereas C3PO had a lot of lines but didn't really contribute much until the very end. So he'd be kind of like some annoying ass kid in your party if you're playing, say, Chrono Fantasy or one of those other games where you have like these annoying characters. Anyway, R2D2 peaked by introducing Obi-Wan to Luke and Leia. That was really his major role in the story. And then he showed some sentimentality by going passive after Luke disappeared. And he's basically been coasting ever since, except for fixing shit. So yeah, that is their story arc. Not much to it, but they did have a little bit of one. And you wouldn't think that robots would get a character arc, but in this case they kinda did. And I would argue that their character arc is still more impressive than Chewie's, and about on par with Han's, which is really disappointing given that Han is an actual human. Last, and in my opinion also least, is Lando Calrissian, the caped casual. He has some character growth, but it is not necessarily good, and the fact that they cast a different actor for the Solo prequel film means that there are 2 versions of him, and there are some differences that we have to consider when looking at his character evolution. The young Lando was a cybersexual rogue with some creepy tendencies. That being said, while I was not a big fan of Danny Glover's Lando Calrissian, I think he was actually an improvement on the original in the sense that he's more interesting. While it's weird that he is having sex with robots, at least he does something interesting, and he has a rather complex relationship with the law that goes beyond just being some guy trying to make profit and being willing to do business with the Empire. At least there are other complications in his character and other weirdnesses. So I could see that working, especially if he evolved beyond that at some point, but we don't really know. Maybe he just became adept at hiding the fact that he's a total pervert. When we meet him in Empire Strikes Back, Lando has become an opportunist running a mining consortium, and he's politically neutral at a time when supposedly the Empire's evil and running amok. He evolved into a rebel officer, mostly because he lost his mining consortium, but he was always a foppish summer soldier who wore a cape and didn't really take things too seriously. He piloted the Millennium Falcon in that last battle of the sector with the Death Star. He does okay, but he, was basically just Black Han Solo for that battle, and I think that proves also that Han Solo was always completely replaceable. You could have Lando Calrissian there, same result, just a different face. So apparently between the originals and the sequels, Lando disappears once again from the scene. He could have been a prominent guy who actually helped run the New Republic, but instead he went back to doing seedy stuff. And so, with some of the characters, they didn't do as much as they could have to maintain law and order and peace. But with Lando, he's especially guilty because clearly, when he reemerges in The Rise of Skywalker, not only has he not done very much for the cause, but he's also out of shape and just really not ready for prime time. So, at least with Luke, he was still in shape, even if he had not really been practicing the Force. But Lando is kind of chunky, old, and just really not useful, given that his only skills are being a cut rate Han Solo, who himself is already a pretty generic assistant hero. So really, Lando starts out as a foppish guy who's just a dilettante, and he ends up as a foppish dilettante who's also old and out of shape. I would say that in many ways he is the most consistent character, and unfortunately he's sort of realistic in the sense there are people who never really change in any meaningful way. So I can't really fault the writers for bad writing here. What I can say is it's just not that interesting, and that while Lando is believable, he's not a strong character, an interesting one, and I do not understand the fanfare that he has received over the years. It is completely undeserved. He's just sort of your slacker loser friend who thinks he's better looking than he actually is. That's what Lando always is and always was, always will be. Anyway, I'm Remarkable Republican, bringing the truth with truth flavored bias, signing out.